The universe that Hal Jordan inhabits presents itself as ordered and luminous, a vast arena governed by codes older than memory and enforced by symbols that promise balance. Light moves with purpose there. Space is divided into sectors, boundaries drawn not by walls but by jurisdiction and belief. Authority does not announce itself as domination. It arrives disguised as stewardship. Power claims to be neutral. The promise is simple. Fear can be mastered. Chaos can be contained. Will is enough. Before crisis appears, before rupture makes itself visible, the system already breathes through him. Hal Jordan enters this world not as an anomaly, but as an ideal fit. He is chosen because the structure recognizes something familiar in him. A temperament aligned with command. A mind trained to act without hesitation. A confidence that treats uncertainty as a temporary obstacle rather than a permanent condition. He does not question the legitimacy of the ring or the order behind it. He trusts that authority earned through courage is authority deserved. This is a universe that rewards decisiveness. Indecision is framed as weakness. Doubt is tolerated only as a step toward clarity. The Green Lanterns do not rule by force alone. They rule by narrative. Each ring carries a story about order overcoming fear. Each oath reaffirms a belief that willpower is the highest virtue. To hesitate is to fail the story. To question the structure is to step outside the light. Hal Jordan thrives here because he believes the story without reservation. He does not wear the role like a costume. He inhabits it. The uniform becomes an extension of his sense of self. The ring does not feel foreign. It feels like confirmation. He was always meant to be this. The system does not coerce him. It reflects him back to himself in an idealized form. Yet beneath the clarity of the mission lies a quieter tension. The world demands guardians who act without fear, but fear is not something that disappears. It compresses. It shifts location. It hides behind conviction. In this universe, fear is treated as an external force, an enemy to be subdued rather than an internal signal to be understood. The language of will leaves little room for vulnerability. Strength becomes synonymous with control. Hal Jordan learns early that hesitation costs lives. He learns that restraint is often indistinguishable from failure. The structure reinforces this lesson repeatedly. Success is measured in outcomes, not reflection. The faster the response, the purer the act. There is no space here for ambiguity. The arena rewards clarity and punishes doubt. This is the condition in which the crisis is seated, not through corruption or betrayal, but through alignment taken too far. A system built to contain fear begins to cultivate a deeper anxiety. What happens when willpower is treated not as a tool, but as a moral absolute? What happens when authority is no longer balanced by uncertainty? Hal Jordan does not seek power for its own sake. That would be too simple. He seeks coherence. He wants the universe to make sense. He wants actions to produce predictable results. He wants responsibility to mean control. In a world constantly threatened by collapse, the promise of absolute authority feels less like temptation and more like necessity. The ring amplifies intention. It does not judge it. This is the unspoken truth at the heart of the system. Power reflects the user. It expands what already exists. In Hal Jordan, it finds a will that refuses limits. Not because of cruelty, but because limits feel irresponsible when lives are at stake. Every boundary appears as a failure of imagination. Every rule as a delay that costs time and blood. Around him, the universe continues to function. The core maintains its rituals. The guardians speak in measured tones. Balance is preserved. On the surface, nothing is wrong. The machine works. The light remains bright. Yet the pressure increases quietly. The system demands ever greater certainty from those who wield it. Neutrality becomes impossible. To act is to choose. To choose is to impose order. Hal Jordan becomes increasingly visible. His successes amplify his presence. The spotlight does not reveal his doubts. It erases them. Public perception simplifies him into an emblem of resolve. He is not seen wrestling with fear. He is seen conquering it. The myth begins to outpace the man. In this environment, fear is no longer an emotion. It becomes a threat to be eliminated. The distinction matters. When fear is externalized, it invites eradication rather than integration. The universe offers Hal Jordan endless arenas in which to prove that fear can be crushed through force of will. Each victory reinforces the belief that mercy is a weakness, that restraint is indulgence. The foundations of absolute authority are laid not through tyranny, but through efficiency. Through the quiet agreement that some decisions are too important to be slowed by doubt. Through the belief that one strong will is preferable to many uncertain voices. The system does not ask Hal Jordan to rule. It asks him to protect. The difference blurs over time. What emerges is not a villain waiting to be revealed, but a structure testing its own limits through him. A question forms beneath the surface. Can willpower remain virtuous when it no longer accepts opposition? Can fear be mastered without being denied? Can authority exist without seducing those who wield it? The conflict does not announce itself yet. It gathers weight. It settles into the architecture of belief. The arena is set. The light holds steady. And within that clarity, something begins to fracture. Hal Jordan's origin is framed by velocity, altitude, and risk. Before the ring, before the core, his identity is already structured around forward motion. He is a test pilot, a figure defined by proximity to failure and faith in control systems pushed to their limits. Flight becomes his first language of meaning. In the air, hesitation is fatal. Precision is survival. Mastery is not philosophical. It is mechanical and immediate. This context matters because it forms the psychological ground on which the ring later lands. His early losses do not teach him caution. They teach him resolve. Tragedy does not soften his relationship with risk. It sharpens it. Where others learn to slow down, Hal learns to push through. Pain becomes something to outrun. Grief becomes something to convert into action. The absence of control is experienced not as a condition of existence, but as an error that must be corrected. This orientation toward reality predates cosmic authority. The ring does not create it. It legitimizes it. The Green Lantern Corps enters his life as a perfectly aligned structure. It offers external validation to an internal posture that already exists. Here is an institution that treats fear as an adversary. Here is a hierarchy that rewards decisiveness and frames hesitation as failure. The Guardians present themselves not as rulers, but as custodians of order. Their authority feels impersonal, abstract, almost ethical by default. They do not dominate through presence. They dominate through distance. This distance is crucial. Authority without intimacy feels clean. Decisions appear objective. Violence becomes procedural. The Corps does not ask its members to hate. It asks them to execute. Morality is embedded in function rather than reflection. Hal Jordan adapts instantly because the system mirrors his internal logic. Responsibility means acting. Acting means imposing structure. Structure means safety. Within the Corps, fear is externalized. It is something that emerges from hostile forces, chaotic planets, unstable species. Fear is always elsewhere. It never belongs to the wielder of the ring. This displacement creates a powerful illusion. If fear is outside, then the self remains pure. The ring bearer becomes a neutral instrument of order. The moral burden shifts away from the individual and into the mission. Hal Jordan embraces this fully. He does not experience the ring as temptation. He experiences it as alignment. The oath functions less as a vow and more as recognition. The language of light and will reinforces an identity already oriented toward control. Where others might feel the weight of authority, Hal feels release. The universe now makes sense. Power has rules. Fear has an answer. Yet even within this harmony, a fracture exists. The core operates as a collective, but it elevates exceptional individuals. Certain figures become symbols. Their actions resonate beyond their sectors. Hal Jordan is one of these figures. His victories are not merely strategic. They are narratively amplified. He becomes a reference point for what willpower looks like when it succeeds. This amplification alters the psychological field. The more Hal is positioned as an ideal, the less space remains for ambiguity. He is no longer just a lantern among others. He becomes a measure. His decisions set precedent. The system begins to bend subtly around him, not because he demands it, but because success invites imitation. Authority consolidates around figures who seem incapable of doubt. At the same time, the guardians remain distant. Their authority is absolute yet abstract. They issue mandates without inhabiting consequence. This creates a vacuum between rule and execution. The lanterns absorb the moral weight of decisions made elsewhere. Hal Jordan fills this vacuum with his own certainty. Where instruction lacks clarity, he supplies conviction. Fear begins to change shape here. It is no longer only the fear of external threats. It becomes the fear of failure, the fear of not acting decisively enough, the fear that restraint might allow catastrophe to unfold. This fear is incompatible with the system's language. It cannot be acknowledged openly. Instead, it is converted into increased resolve. The ring responds flawlessly. It amplifies will without resistance. It does not question intention. This creates a closed loop. Confidence produces results. Results reinforce confidence. The system appears self-correcting. There is no obvious moment where excess becomes visible. Authority expands quietly, justified by outcomes. Other forces within the universe complicate this foundation. Figures aligned with fear operate through projection and spectacle. They embody everything the core defines itself against. This opposition reinforces the lantern narrative. Fear is dramatized as monstrous. Will is framed as salvation. The binary hardens. Complexity erodes. Hal Jordan's psychological makeup is particularly vulnerable to this hardening. He does not distrust power. He distrusts limits. Any structure that restricts action feels arbitrary when measured against the scale of potential loss. This is not arrogance in the conventional sense. It is a moral impatience. The belief that delay is complicity. The origins of the conflict lie here, not in corruption, but in coherence taken to an extreme. A man shaped by velocity enters a system that equates speed with virtue. A structure built to contain fear rewards those who deny it most effectively. Authority grows not through domination, but through agreement. By the time tension begins to surface, the foundations are already set. Willpower has become synonymous with moral clarity. Fear has been fully externalized. Authority has shed its need for reflection. The stage is prepared not for rebellion, but for inevitability. The first visible shift does not arrive as a rupture. It arrives as acceleration. Hal Jordan begins to act faster than the system around him can fully absorb. Missions that once required consultation become instinctive. Decisions that once passed through collective deliberation now resolve in the space of a breath. The universe does not resist this change. On the contrary, it rewards it. Crises end sooner. Casualties decrease. Order is restored with remarkable efficiency. This is how authority deepens without announcing itself. Effectiveness becomes its own justification. The structure does not correct Hal Jordan because there is nothing to correct, at least not yet. Results speak louder than process. The guardians observe from their distance. The core adapts around his pace. What was once exceptional begins to feel necessary. The arena expands. Threats grow more complex. Enemies learn to exploit hesitation. Every delay becomes a potential catastrophe. In this environment, restraint no longer reads as virtue. It reads as negligence. Hal Jordan internalizes this logic completely. Each mission reinforces the same conclusion. When will is decisive, fear recedes. When fear is confronted directly, chaos collapses. What changes is not his intent, but his relationship to opposition. Disagreement begins to feel like friction rather than dialogue. Alternative strategies appear as distractions. The moral weight of leadership settles into his posture. He carries not only responsibility, but expectation. Others begin to defer instinctively, not out of fear, but out of trust. Trust is a subtle accelerant. It removes resistance. It clears space. When people stop questioning your judgment no longer encounters limits. Hal Jordan does not ask for this. He absorbs it. The center of gravity shifts quietly toward him. At the same time, fear tightens its grip elsewhere. The universe watches its guardians succeed with increasing force. Stories circulate. Victories become legends. The image of willpower conquering fear is amplified across sectors. The symbolic field polarizes. On one side stands decisive authority. On the other stands chaotic threat. This polarization reshapes perception. Complex actors are reduced to emblems. Enemies are no longer seen as systems or conditions. They are faces of fear itself. The narrative simplifies because simplicity moves faster. Hal Jordan moves faster. Within this momentum, internal checks weaken. The core remains a collective, but its cohesion now depends on alignment rather than debate. To question Hal's decisions feels increasingly like questioning the mission itself. Dissent becomes psychologically costly. Agreement feels safer, cleaner. The ring continues to respond without resistance. It does not signal excess. It does not fatigue. It does not reflect back the cost of expansion. Power remains weightless to the one who wields it most effectively. This creates a dangerous asymmetry. The consequences of authority appear everywhere except within the authority itself. Hal Jordan's internal landscape narrows. Not emotionally, but structurally. The range of acceptable responses compresses. Options that involve waiting, negotiation, or uncertainty feel irresponsible. The universe has taught him that problems yield to pressure. Why hesitate now? Fear, once external, begins to mirror itself. The fear of chaos becomes the fear of insufficient control. The fear of loss becomes the fear of limits. This fear does not weaken him. It sharpens him. It fuels expansion. Other figures notice the shift. Some align with it. Others recoil. Tension emerges not through open conflict, but through misalignment of tempo. Hal moves faster than consensus, faster than reflection, faster than the symbolic structures designed to contain power. The first fractures appear here, not as rebellion, but as lag. The system struggles to keep pace with its most effective instrument. Authority begins to outgrow the architecture meant to hold it. The center expands. The perimeter strains. Hal Jordan does not perceive this as imbalance. He perceives it as necessity. The universe feels fragile. Every delay feels dangerous. Every boundary feels arbitrary. Willpower remains the only constant he trusts. By the end of this movement, the conflict has taken shape. Not yet as collapse, but as pressure. Authority has begun to seduce not through promise, but through performance. The idea that one will properly focused might be enough to hold the universe together no longer feels extreme. It feels reasonable. The second movement begins when resistance finally takes form, not as a direct challenge to Hal Jordan's authority, but as friction within the structure itself. The core starts to feel uneven. Decisions ripple outward faster than consensus can stabilize them. Orders arrive already resolved. Outcomes are presented as inevitabilities rather than choices. The language of command remains calm, but its direction has narrowed. This is where authority stops feeling shared, not because Hal claims ownership, but because the system reorganizes around his certainty. The center becomes heavy. Gravity increases. Other lanterns begin to orbit rather than engage. Their roles shift subtly from agents to extensions. Individual judgment is not forbidden. It simply becomes redundant. The guardians respond with distance rather than correction. They observe patterns, not people. From their vantage point, the system still functions. Order persists. Threats are neutralized. Metrics remain favorable. Intervention would introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty feels dangerous in a universe already strained. Silence becomes endorsement. Hal Jordan interprets this silence as trust, more precisely as confirmation. The absence of restraint validates his acceleration. Authority without opposition feels clean. It suggests alignment rather than domination. He does not experience himself as imposing will. He experiences himself as carrying it on behalf of others. Yet the psychological cost begins to surface in the margins. When opposition does appear, it no longer registers as disagreement. It registers as obstruction. Alternative perspectives feel disconnected from reality. Those who hesitate seem unable to grasp the scale of threat. Their caution appears indulgent, detached, almost immoral. Fear now operates on two levels. Externally, it remains the enemy to be subdued. Internally, it mutates into vigilance. The fear of failure becomes constant. The fear of letting the universe slip through his grasp sharpens his resolve further. Control becomes synonymous with care. Relinquishing authority feels indistinguishable from abandonment. This is the moment where willpower crosses an invisible threshold. It stops being a response to fear and becomes its mirror. The more Hal suppresses fear externally, the more it reappears as pressure to maintain dominance. Authority must expand to remain effective. Stability requires escalation. Symbols shift accordingly. The ring no longer feels like a tool among others. It feels central, indispensable. The core no longer reads as a collective shield, but as a network supporting a primary axis. Hal Jordan stands at that axis not as ruler, but as fulcrum. Remove him, and the structure collapses. Opposition becomes inevitable here, not because others seek power, but because balance demands resistance. Figures aligned with alternative readings of order emerge. They question not Hal's intent, but the narrowing of possibility around him. These challenges do not land as critique. They land as threats. The arena changes. Conflict is no longer about stopping villains. It becomes about enforcing coherence. Hal begins to act preemptively. Potential disruptions are treated as actual dangers. Intent matters less than trajectory. If a force could destabilize order, it must be contained now. This shift is subtle but decisive. Authority no longer reacts. It anticipates. In doing so, It claims territory that once belonged to uncertainty. The future becomes a space to be occupied rather than awaited. Control extends beyond action into prediction. The universe responds with resistance, not always violent, sometimes symbolic. Alliances strain. Trust erodes. The image of willpower begins to fracture in public perception. Some see salvation, others see overreach. Polarization hardens. Neutral ground disappears. Hal Jordan experiences this polarization as misunderstanding. The clarity that guides him feels obvious. That others cannot see it only reinforces his conviction. If order is fragile, then ambiguity is a luxury the universe cannot afford. By the end of this movement, the conflict has fully polarized. Authority stands opposed not by chaos, but by limits. The question is no longer whether Hal Jordan will act, but whether anything remains capable of restraining him. Willpower has become absolute in its own logic. Fear has been displaced entirely outward. The structure holds, but only under increasing strain. The third movement unfolds when authority no longer expands through consensus or success, but through necessity. The system reaches a point where reversal feels impossible. Retreat would not restore balance. It would expose fragility. Hal Jordan senses this before it is articulated. The structure now depends on continuity. Any interruption threatens collapse. This is where control transforms into obligation. Hal no longer acts because he believes he is right. He acts because stopping would unravel everything that has been built around him. Authority has sedimented into infrastructure. Remove the center, and the weight redistributes violently. The universe, once held together by shared mandate, now feels suspended from a single axis of will. Fear returns here, not as emotion but as architecture. It becomes embedded in contingency planning, in preemptive action, in the refusal to tolerate unknown variables. The future is treated as hostile terrain. It must be secured before it can surprise. Every unregulated space appears as an opening for collapse. Hal Jordan's perception narrows further. Opposition is no longer personal or ideological. It is structural. Anything that resists alignment is treated as destabilizing force. The language of protection replaces the language of debate. Authority frames itself as burden rather than privilege. He carries the weight so others do not have to. The ring continues to respond with perfect obedience. It does not question escalation. It does not register moral saturation. Power remains responsive, immediate, clean. This absence of friction reinforces the illusion that expansion carries no cost. The damage occurs elsewhere, in trust, in legitimacy, in the symbolic fabric that once allowed authority to feel shared. The core fractures not through rebellion, but through dissonance. Some lanterns withdraw. Others comply mechanically. A few confront openly and are neutralized, not out of malice, but out of perceived necessity. Order must be preserved. Hesitation is framed as threat. Public perception hardens into camps. Hal Jordan becomes a symbol more than a person. To some, he embodies resolve in a universe too fragile for compromise. To others, he represents the danger of unchecked certainty. The image amplifies beyond his control. The spotlight flattens complexity. Echo replaces nuance. This amplification feeds back into the conflict. Symbols generate pressure. The more Hal is seen as absolute, the less room he has to be anything else. Authority traps its bearer as effectively as it constrains others. The role becomes inescapable. At this stage, the collapse is not sudden. It is cumulative. Small violations accumulate. Lines are crossed quietly, justified by urgency. Each act feels reasonable in isolation. Together, They form a pattern that can no longer be denied. The structure built to contain fear has reproduced it in another form. The turning point does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as saturation. The system reaches maximum tension. Expansion can no longer compensate for instability. Authority is nowhere left to grow. Resistance converges. Consequences become unavoidable. Hal Jordan stands at the center of this convergence not as villain, but as artifact. A figure shaped by a system that rewarded will without restraint. The collapse that follows is not betrayal. It is release. Pressure finds its outlet. What breaks is not only the structure of power, but the narrative that sustained it. Willpower is revealed as insufficient when detached from limits. Fear, denied for too long, returns amplified. Authority fragments under the weight of its own certainty. The movement ends with clarity, not redemption. The cost of absolute authority becomes visible, not as punishment, but as outcome. The universe absorbs the shock. The myth fractures. What remains is not resolution, but residue. A question etched into the symbolic landscape. What happens when will refuses to yield? The conflict does not end here. It settles. It becomes reference. The consequences ripple outward, reshaping how power will be imagined long after the collapse has passed. Once the collapse settles, the conflict ceases to belong to Hal Jordan alone. It spreads outward into the symbolic architecture of the universe he helped reshape. The damage is not measured only in broken alliances or fractured institutions, but in perception itself. Authority no longer appears neutral. Power no longer feels weightless. The myth of willpower has been altered permanently. Within the narrative world, the Green Lantern Corps can no longer present itself as a seamless embodiment of order. Its rituals remain, its symbols persist, but their meaning has shifted. The ring is no longer seen only as a safeguard against fear. It becomes a reminder of how easily certainty can harden into domination. The light still shines, but it now casts a longer shadow. This shift produces a cultural hesitation. Where once decisiveness inspired confidence, it now invites scrutiny. Every assertion of authority is measured against the memory of overreach. The universe develops a reflex. Power is no longer admired automatically. It is interrogated. The cost of ignoring limits has been made visible, and visibility changes behavior. Hal Jordan's transformation becomes a reference point, a cautionary figure embedded into collective memory. He is not remembered simply as a hero who fell or a guardian who failed. He is remembered as a demonstration. His story articulates a structural truth, that systems built to suppress fear can reproduce it through control. That moral clarity, when severed from restraint, becomes indistinguishable from coercion. The cultural imagination absorbs this lesson unevenly. Some interpret Hal's arc as tragedy, a good man consumed by responsibility. Others read it as inevitability, a predictable outcome of concentrating power without friction. These competing interpretations generate ongoing polarization. His image functions as a mirror. Different audiences see their own anxieties reflected back at them. In broader cultural terms, the story resonates because it speaks to a recurring human pattern. Societies often elevate figures who promise certainty in moments of instability. The desire for order intensifies when fear saturates the environment. Hal Jordan's narrative dramatizes how easily protection can slide into preemption, how quickly care can transform into control. This resonance extends beyond the fictional universe into the meta-cultural space of its audience. The figure of the incorruptible authority figure, armed with absolute conviction, taps into deep psychological longings. Safety, clarity, relief from ambiguity. At the same time, his downfall externalizes a collective fear that surrendering complexity to strength may carry irreversible consequences. Symbolically, the conflict reframes the concept of will itself. Willpower is no longer presented as an unqualified good. It becomes conditional, effective only when bounded by recognition of limits. The story destabilizes the fantasy that enough resolve can solve any problem. It insists instead on tension, on negotiation between force and restraint. The arena imagery shifts accordingly. The universe is no longer a space to be mastered through domination. It becomes a contested territory where power must move carefully. Boundaries regain importance. Perimeters matter again. The center can no longer expand indefinitely without resistance. Media within the narrative world reflects this recalibration. Stories circulate that emphasize collective action over singular authority. Symbols diversify. The spotlight fragments. No single figure is allowed to carry the full weight of order again without challenge. This is not reform driven by benevolence, but by memory. Hal Jordan's image remains persistent precisely because it resists simplification. He cannot be comfortably categorized as villain or martyr. His arc exposes the uncomfortable truth that moral failure does not always originate in malice. Sometimes it grows from coherence pursued without interruption. This complexity sustains the myth. Simple stories resolve. Complex ones endure. Hal Jordan's conflict continues to echo because it refuses emotional closure. It leaves behind a pressure point in cultural consciousness, a reminder that authority always carries a seduction, and that the desire to eliminate fear can become its most efficient vehicle. The symbolic meaning stabilizes here, not as lesson delivered, but as tension preserved. The story does not warn against power itself. It warns against power unexamined, against will divorced from humility, against certainty that no longer listens. In this way, the conflict reshapes not only how heroes are imagined, but how systems of protection are evaluated. It insists that vigilance must extend inward as well as outward, that fear cannot be destroyed without consequence. It can only be engaged. The cultural impact endures because the question it raises remains unresolved. How much authority is necessary to preserve order, and how much becomes indistinguishable from the threat it claims to oppose? What remains after the collapse is not silence, but structure altered by memory. The universe continues to function, yet it does so with an awareness it did not previously possess. Authority still exists. Guardians still issue mandates. Rings still answer to will. But the confidence that once surrounded these elements has thinned. Power now carries a visible weight. It is no longer abstract. It has a history. Hal Jordan's legacy settles into this altered terrain as a fixed reference point. He becomes less a character than a contour in the symbolic landscape. His story is no longer told to inspire emulation, but to orient judgment. When new figures rise, they are measured against him, not against his virtues alone, but against the arc that followed those virtues when left unchecked. This is how the conflict persists, not as active war, but as embedded tension. The memory of absolute authority lingers inside every assertion of order. Decision-making slows where it once rushed forward. Doubt, previously framed as weakness, re-enters as a necessary pressure. The system does not repent. It adapts, and adaptation is never clean. The core itself bears this imprint unevenly. Some members internalize restraint as discipline. Others carry resentment, believing the reaction went too far, that fear of overreach has replaced fear of chaos. These opposing responses keep the conflict alive beneath the surface. balance is not restored. It is negotiated continuously. Hal Jordan's image fractures into multiple symbolic roles depending on where it is invoked. In moments of crisis, he is remembered as proof that one can move worlds. In moments of consolidation, he is cited as warning. The same figure stabilizes and destabilizes in equal measure. This ambivalence is not resolved because it cannot be. It reflects a permanent condition of power. Psychologically, his legacy articulates a boundary that had previously remained invisible. The boundary between responsibility and possession, between carrying authority and becoming indistinguishable from it. Hal Jordan crossed that boundary not through desire for domination, but through refusal to relinquish control. The distinction matters, and it unsettles easy moral categorization. The symbolic residue of fear also remains. Fear was never eliminated. It was displaced, amplified, and redistributed. The attempt to eradicate it through willpower exposed its persistence as structural force. In the aftermath, fear becomes more complex, less theatrical, more internal. It is no longer embodied solely by enemies, but by memory of collapse. This reshaping influences how future threats are perceived. The universe becomes more cautious, but also more fragmented. Without a singular axis of authority, coordination becomes slower. Debate returns. So does inefficiency. These are not celebrated outcomes. They are accepted as cost. The price of avoiding absolute authority is living with unresolved tension. Hal Jordan's final position in this landscape is paradoxical. He is both caution and temptation. The promise he once embodied has not disappeared. In moments of extreme threat, the desire for decisive will resurfaces. The fantasy of absolute control remains seductive precisely because it once worked. The collapse did not erase its effectiveness. It revealed its cost. This is why the conflict never truly ends. It cycles. It waits. The conditions that produced Hal Jordan can re-emerge whenever fear outpaces patience. His story endures because it maps a trajectory that remains available. The arc is not closed. It is documented. In this sense, his legacy is not moral instruction, but structural exposure. The universe now knows what happens when willpower becomes unbounded by resistance. It knows the shape of that path. Knowing does not prevent repetition. It only changes the terms under which repetition occurs. The final clarity lies here. Absolute authority does not arrive as corruption. It arrives as solution. It does not announce itself as domination. It presents itself as care without limits. Hal Jordan's story persists because it captures that seduction precisely. The moment when protection becomes possession. When fear is no longer confronted, but replaced by certainty. The light remains. The shadow remains with it. And the space between them, once ignored, becomes the true arena where power is now contested.